Good evening, everyone. My name's Steve Outhouse with Right Recruiter, and we're glad that you're here as part of our summer series. Having some great speakers in. We had Eric Duncan, MP Eric Duncan, in to do our first webinar a couple weeks ago, or actually about a month ago now. And then Rachel Curran, former Director of Policy for Prime Minister Stephen Harper, joined us about 2 weeks ago. And we've got a great guest with us tonight who I'll introduce in just a moment. So whether you're joining us live or you're one of the more the group that signed up so that you can get this video on demand and sort of watch it in your own on your own time. We appreciate you logging in, appreciate you being a part of this process. So Right Recruiter is still a very new organization, just sort of getting up and running, but the vision behind it is really to help Conservatives win elections at all levels of government, federal, provincial, municipal, and then to form governments and help our staffers in particular operate good governments that are worthy of re-election. And so our first two guests that we've had have been a bit more involved on the federal scene. Well, they've been involved in provincial as well, but kind of have, had their main experience at the federal level. Today, we're going to move into the provincial side of things. And speaking of good governments that deserve to get re-elected, our guest today is Marshall Smith. And Marshall, first I'll give you his formal bio and intro, and then I'm just going to say a few words about Marshall. Marshall is a 25-year veteran of government and political operations, serving administrations in both Alberta and British Columbia. He's currently serving as Chief of Staff to the Premier of Alberta, and Marshall is known nationally for his expertise in complex systems transformation. Most recently, he served as Chief of Staff to the Minister for Mental Health and Addiction in Alberta. He's also served in British Columbia as the Chief of Staff to the Minister for the Vancouver 2010 Olympic and Paralympic Winter Games, Municipal Affairs, and Multicultural Services. Marshall's widely known, and you may have seen him in various sort of media appearances. He's widely known as the architect of the Alberta model for mental health and addiction, which is, as I was saying, in terms of his expertise of transforming systems, it's a government-wide system transformation, and it's one that is drawing attention from different governments across the country, really looking around at what Marshall and the team are doing in Alberta. And obviously this was a key component of Premier Smith's election campaign that happened just, some time ago. I'd like to just sort of, briefly add my 2 cents to Marshall. So Marshall, we can call him up here on the screen there, Josh. So Marshall, I'd heard lots of stories about campaign managers and chiefs of staff working together, some good and some not so good. For those who don't know, I was the campaign manager for the UCP in the recent election. And so when I met Marshall, it was great, I will say, in terms of just our ability to work together. Marshall made me feel very welcome and part of the team. And I appreciate you a lot for that, Marshall, and us working together. Obviously, very separate, but not totally separate worlds when you're working in government and then moving into a RIT period. And we'll probably talk a little bit about that tonight. But Marshall has been just a great guy to work with. Really appreciate you, Marsh, and thanks for being here tonight.
I appreciate that, Steve, and you're right. I mean, I don't know why any chief of staff wouldn't work well with the campaign manager. I couldn't wait to dump it all on your plate. It doesn't make sense to me. So thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Oh, that's great. Yes, as we were getting closer and closer to the RIT period, I did hear the phrase come out of your mouth a lot more. That's a Steve problem. That's a Steve problem. So it was good. Well, yes. So thanks for being here tonight. And just to make sure everyone's aware of kind of how we run this, we're going to be diving right into questions here with Marshall. We like to make the most. We keep this at an hour at max, and we're going to get into the Q&A. If you have questions for Marshall and you want to pose them, you can put those in the chat, and we'll be pulling them up as time as time permits. So please feel free to chime in at any point in time in the chat. The only other thing I'm going to say is where I'm in the middle. I'm located in Ottawa, and I'm in the middle of a tornado warning time right now. So as I said to Marshall just in the pre-interview, if my power goes out, we do have a producer who'll sort of emerge from the background and ask some of the questions, but hopefully that's not going to happen. So So, Marshall, let's dive right in. And the first question I like to ask all of our guests is, how did you become a staffer? It seems like everyone's story is a little bit different. How did you get involved in political staffer life?
It was a total fluke, and really not anything that was under my direct control. That's a bit of a theme for my career. I started working in government after high school, and coming out of high school, I wanted to work in law enforcement, and so I joined the British Columbia Corrections Branch. That would have been in the early '90s, and had a great career there for many, many years. Worked my way sort of up through the ranks as a young correctional officer around different facilities in British Columbia, and promoted out of the corrections branch. This was an NDP government that I worked for in the '90s in BC, and
they were in there a while, weren't they?
They were in there for a while, and took my first management post in government in personnel. And was the human resource advisor to the Attorney General of British Columbia, who was Ujjal Dosanjh at the time, and did developed a reputation for myself of being a really kind of fun and effective project guy, and had managed some pretty significant scale projects. And at the time, I know a lot of the people who are listening to the show are probably quite young, looking at coming into, government at the same time. This was around the time when we were putting computers on people's desks. So it was around the Windows 95 era, right? The first sort of, until then we had these these boxes on our desk called Comprehensive Electronic Office. And we could send little messages back and forth to each other. And you were really something in the office if you had a yellow and green screen, that you had really achieved status. And the rest of us peons had black and white screens. But so, hiring young high-tech talent to government, creating, websites for government was a big deal. And so I was part of the team that managed that process at the Information Science and Technology Agency. And in 2001, when Gordon Campbell and the BC Liberals, swept to power, I remember sitting in my office in Victoria, and I got a call from the Deputy Chief of Staff to the Premier. I answered the phone, and he said, Marshall Smith, yeah, Neil Sweeney, please come to the Premier's office at 11 o'clock, click. And okay. Yeah. And so I went, talked to my manager, went down for an interview. They said, we want you to come on board with us. And I did. And that was my first post. And I wound up as Chief of Staff to Ted Nebling, rest his soul. He's deceased now, but he was my first minister. Responsible for the procurement of the 2010 Olympic bid.
And so what was that? I mean, that's pretty cool. I mean, you say some people feel they're called into office. You got the direct call.
Yeah, I wasn't called.
How is that different from coming outside from within the public service? I mean, certainly within law enforcement and so on, it's got to be a little bit of a little culture shock there for you.
I think law enforcement, career in law enforcement really prepared me well for politics. It's a very similar, right? Dynamic situations, always changing, anticipate, be sharp, be smart, anticipate risk at all places. It really did prepare me very well. So, I am very grateful for that. And of course my, career in early politics, pretty much most people who know me or have heard about me know that, my, early on in my career in politics, went from having this sort of, great career doing the Olympics and being in the, a young man in the halls of power and, cabinet and ministers and flying around the world, and absolutely, really destroyed my life and career with alcohol and addiction. And so that era of my career in the early 2000s, I basically, got very sick with alcoholism and addiction, wound up, losing my career at that point, hanging up my suit and tie at the legislature, and became a homeless drug addict on the downtown east side, and where I lived for about 4.5 years. And during that time, that was, obviously a very, kind of dark era of my life, very challenging. But really opened my eyes to a lot of, a lot of things personally, and then later on professionally. And when I cleaned up and went to treatment, and kind of had to revision what my life was going to be like, really rededicated my life to service. And I was lucky to be alive, and so I'm very, very grateful. Had a lot of gratitude all the way along, for the privilege of being able to serve, and to really work on meaningful things. And that obviously I'm a very driven guy. And anybody who knows me knows I'm pretty matter of fact, to the point type of person. And so, went from eating out of garbage cans in the alleys of Hastings, all the way to where I am today. And that wasn't easy. But again, I wake up every morning full of gratitude in the privilege of being able to do what I do. So.
Yeah, really appreciate you sharing that. I mean, your story it's so inspirational on many levels. And, I've got to see firsthand how, yes, you are definitely a driven individual, but it's very interesting to see how your personal experiences and so on have, shaped your policy focus, and trying, and turn that into really something very positive for many other people. And I'm going to circle back to that a little bit later in our discussion. But I'd like to start with just, or kind of the next kind of part of this. We've got people who will be tuning in now or watching this when they see the video later on, emailed out to them, and they'll be across the country. So every province, every provincial government is slightly different. Obviously, the federal government's different. Can you talk us through, just to start with, sort of the nuts and bolts of the Alberta government? Like, what is your structure? You're the chief of staff in the Premier's office. Do you have kind of a functional role where you're working with / overseeing ministers' offices? Or those independent of each other? Maybe just walk us through a little bit about that. Sure. And to give us a starting point.
Sure. So, the basics of it is the cabinet is the government, right? And I think a lot of people, when they talk about government, they talk about, kind of the, everybody, the public service, and right. The reality is that the cabinet and the cabinet ministers, they are the government. The public service is the public service, and we generally refer to them as government, but cabinet is the government. In Alberta, we have 24 ministers, and each of those ministers has a staff. One of the interesting things about the way, at least in Alberta, the way that this works, and it was the same in British Columbia as well. You have the Premier, and the Premier really has two staff. She has the deputy minister to the Premier, or the head of the public service, and the chief of staff, who is the head of all of the political arm of government. So all of the ministers' offices, all of that, everything that functions out of that. And then under Ray Gilmore is the head of the public service in Alberta, and he's got, all of the deputy ministers and the ministry staff that report up to him in this, great big tree. And then on the political side, I have all of the chiefs of staff, and then all of the staff, underneath them, and we all report into the Premier. The cabinet ministers themselves are sort of a floating entity, right? They are deciders. And while I deploy staff to support them. At the end of the day, all of the staff in their office ultimately report to me, and then through me to the Premier. So, a lot of that's a shock to some ministers, quite frankly, when they're when they come in. A lot of ministers want to sort of like bring in all of their people, and that's not really the way it works. I, of course, try to be very deferential with ministers and work with them to understand their preferences and desires, and who is going to be a good fit. Of course, part of my job is staffing the building to ensure that we have ministers positioned to be as successful as they possibly can be, and happy, and that is certainly true of the staff as well. So that's the structure. I have about 320 staff that report to me, so quite a lot of people, and great people. We really have great people in Alberta. A lot of really dedicated young people that I enjoy working with them very much.
Now that must pose some challenges too. I'm gonna call up a question from Daryl here, who this touches on what I wanted to ask next. And so Daryl poses the question: how do you coordinate with staffers and government officials at different levels of government? I mean, to me, just the way you described it, I mean, I have 320 people. Obviously, that's more than what you can sort of, or what a normal person would ever have to really directly oversee. And obviously, the chiefs of staff who are reporting to you functionally, I guess there would be a lot of the day-to-day operations would be happening within those offices, but ultimately you're accountable in giving that direction. But how do you do that coordination? How do you make sure that everyone is sort of working together and rowing in the same way?
Muscle.
There we go.
Well, look,
Next question.
We have weekly meetings in the cabinet room with my chiefs, of which there are 24 of them, one for each minister. And they really are my senior management team. And then each of them has people, under them that kind of report to them. So, I take notes throughout the week of things that I need to communicate to them. Things that have come up during the week, different expectations, things that the Premier has mused about, that she wants in terms of direction, and a lot of other, a litany of other things that we have to deal with on a regular basis, from, updating them about new and emerging policies, recognition, giving out kudos for jobs well done, talking a little bit about high-level strategy. And then it's really their job to go back and communicate down into the organization. I also, having said that, if you ask our staff in our building, they will tell you that I have a habit, on Fridays or, the odd days, I go and circulate in the building, and I'll go sort of from office to office, talking to everybody from, clerks, right on up, and I'll go and check in on them. I like to certainly get to know everybody's name and a little bit about them. And, I find even, going in once a week and asking how people are doing is great. And it's good to see them and see what's going on.
Well, I think let's toss up this question from Justin in Edmonton. It kind of ties into a little bit of what you've just said. I mean, there's some other words or other things that you would use to describe your management style.
Right. Well,
and if this is one of your direct reports, of course, then...
I'm sure it absolutely is one of my direct reports. Look, this is a tough job, and there's a lot of moving parts, and I try my very best as a manager to allow people to walk into the Premier's office and walk into my office and ask for 5 minutes. Most of the time that's possible. It isn't possible all of the time. But I try and be as accessible as I can. That, for example, in British Columbia, that wasn't the case. In British Columbia, the Premier's office was a fortress. You were not getting in there without an appointment, and often, that could take weeks, right, to get. And we're in government in a fast-moving environment. The most important thing for a staffer in the building is access to decision making, right? Access to decision making is the most important thing that you have, because if you can't get a decision or a signal check on a direction, then you're paralyzed until you get that clarity. So I understand that, having been a staffer, junior staffer, and worked up from the ranks, that's really important. And I'll spend a lot of time with chunks of my schedule available, for people just to walk in and have a conversation about something that they're working on that they're stuck on. So I have, truth be told, there are some quirky aspects to me as well. I get a little bit hyper concerned about dress and comportment around the building. I believe I'm a little bit of a traditionalist in terms of the building that we work in and maintaining that image and professionalism. We are a conservative government. I don't want to see pants that are 4 inches too short. Or unironed shirts or this, that, and the other thing. I expect the staff to look and dress professionally. And I have no problem letting them know that when
I've been on meetings with you when that's happened. Yes.
So, those are important things. And, I have been known to drag a young staffer with me to the West Edmonton Mall shopping, and that is not a place that you want to be.
Yeah. When your chief of staff asks to spend time with you, that's great.
We're going to the store.
Yeah. I remember being on a call with you once, and I was just wearing a t-shirt or something, and you were quite that day very dressy, and so I went and put a tie on with my t-shirt, and I don't think it was very impressive. I don't think it achieved what I was hoping to do. So thanks, Daryl, and thanks, Justin, for your questions. And Daryl, I am going to come back to your follow-up because it ties into somewhere I'm going to go, but I want to just follow up a little bit more, Marshall, on what you were talking about access to decision making. So how are decisions made? Like you talked about, ministers being deciders, and kind of being the entities that are there. What is the actual process for government to make a decision, and how does that go, and how do staffers feed into that?
So look, political staffers' job, in particular the chief of staff in a minister's office, the other staff, the other positions that are available in a minister's office are, a clerk, scheduler, ministerial assistant, not minister's assistant. There's a big difference there.
Actually, do you want to elaborate on what that difference is?
So there is a lot of times when ministers think that the ministerial assistant is the minister's assistant, and that isn't the case. The ministerial assistant reports to the chief of staff and is there to help the chief of staff run the affairs of the minister's office, and to be their sort of eyes and ears. Policy advisors, as the title would suggest, should have some kind of expertise, in a particular policy. And then there's chiefs, which of course are the boss of the office. And so the chief's job is to be sort of in between the deputy minister and the minister. And the chief's job is to be the political lens, the blue part of the flame. Their job is to manage all aspects of the minister's office, to provide support, advice, and recommend decisive action to the minister, and to assist the deputy minister, who is the top civil servant in the public service in that ministry, to assist them in interpreting political will into public policy, right? And vice versa, right? The chief will also hear from the public service and come to the minister with difficult decisions that need to be made or a range of options to select from. And typically, the work that we do in government is there's a problem identified that government wants to take some action on, and direction will be given, usually, from the minister through the chief to the deputy minister, that we want to do a thing, and they will come back with a briefing note that will lay out options, right, of how to do that, and ministers will pick which of those options, sign the briefing note. It's a note for decision, and it will go in, and the work will start. Now, some decisions of government require cabinet approval, and some decisions are things that the ministers can just make themselves. And in terms of the premier, the head of government, the premier minister, because she's a minister as well, we in the premier's office provide mandate letters to each minister that lays out what the premier's expectation is that minister will accomplish during the term. And it's usually about 2 pages of bulleted notes of things that they will execute on. And those mandate letters basically form the basis of the performance evaluation that the premier and our office will use to evaluate the effectiveness of, in the premier's case, the minister, and in my case, the chief of staff and the office. And the deputy minister in the ministry also gets a copy of that letter. And those mandate items are also the items that are used to evaluate their performance. So mandate letters are not ornamental. They are a critical instrument of government. And out of all of those mandate items, those items will go to the ministry, and they will form the basis. Each of those items forms the basis of some form of cabinet submission, right? And so each of those items will eventually wind up on the cabinet agenda for a decision, on execution. So that's really how that's done. That's what the sausage maker looks like. And it's just, a lot of moving parts to get those things across. And then, of course, each of those things has budget implications, that have to be worked through as well.
Right. I'm going to do a follow-up there just to remind folks, if you have questions for Marshall Smith, to drop them there in the chat. We'll be getting to those here in just a moment. So I just want to dig a little bit deeper. And this is what I said. I wanted to come back a little bit to your story and your personal journey and how that ties in, and just sort of as from a staffer's perspective. So yes, the mandate letters go out from the premier's office. And I just a quick side note on that. I find it very interesting because when I started in government, it was like when the federal Conservatives won in 2006 was my first time in government. The mandate letter was something that it was not public at all. It was given to us, and we knew it was there, and and senior officials would work on it, but it was nothing public. And now we've gone this whole thing where I've been seeing your ministers, doing videos explaining this is what I'm working on here over the next, for the term and so on. So it's just I just note that it's just of interest.
Look, it's something that we started doing, and I'm a big supporter of that kind of transparency. It's very helpful for stakeholders. There doesn't need to be a mystery to government. We ran on a very clear platform and said what we will do. And then the mandate letters explain at an even more detailed letter what it is that we will do. And it allows stakeholders and others, to begin getting themselves organized, to move. So I think it's actually a great development in the way that government operates.
Yeah, it's interesting to see such a change in just like that short relatively short period of time. But now, how much of that now? I mean, in addition to the, what's given by the premier, how much could you take into that role, like with your passion for these mental health and addiction issues and so on? Like, obviously getting to work with that minister would allow you, there would be transactional items and, kind of, there's all those decisions on the day to day that are kind of outside of mandate letters because you're just managing an entire ministry. But how much of that can you shape if you're passionate about whether it's justice issues or, social issues or, economic issues? How much as a staffer and as even a minister in that do you get to shape, kind of versus mandate letter versus personal interests and things that you like?
Well, look, I would liken it like this. So think about the formula for Coca-Cola, right? The mandate letter is the ingredients printed on the can. And the magic work that goes into it is really figuring out what order those ingredients have to go in and how to blend them in order to get a glass of Coca-Cola, right? So it's one thing to, put these items in a bulleted list down on a piece of paper, but the art of government is lifting those things off that paper and making them dance in a way that is, both palatable to the public, timed correctly, budgeted correctly, and communicated, well out there. And that is the art of political staffing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, to directly answer your question, yes, there's significant influence in, the way that the Premier's office and myself works with ministers to help them refine their views and timing and the way that they take action. I'm in our government, we've split policy portfolios. I mean, often you'll have a principal secretary or, policy directors. So I carry a policy portfolio, a specific policy portfolio, aside from all of the other, chief of staff things that I do, which I'm still learning, some of those things that come up. I look after health, mental health and addiction, public safety, Indigenous relations, community social services, and children's services.
Mm-hmm.
So that is the basket of policies that I am intensely involved in on an everyday basis. I'm in those files, talking with those ministers, working with those chiefs. The other ministries are, on a day-to-day basis from a policy perspective are managed by other staff. That would be simply too much for any person to digest. And so each of those groupings of ministries forms a cabinet committee, right? Okay. And so that's how that works.
Excellent. Now, you use the phrase in there, the art of political staffing. I'd like to get a question here from Nathan, who put this up. It says, what distinguishes an effective and useful staffer?
Yeah, that's a great question, Nathan. There are a couple of like really key things that distinguish effective and useful staffers, and these are them in no particular order. One is be grateful. Be grateful that you have this job. There are a lot of people who do not have these jobs. It's a privilege to serve. And you should fight the entitlement monster at every step of the way. Two is dress like you're a serious player. If you want to be treated seriously and advance, put a professional face on it and look the part, right? Second is, punctuality and timing. Come to work, be on time. Be sober, and and, be ready and be good for all occasions. You never know what you're going to get into. Your day can go from, touring around in alleyways to doing a photo shoot in a field of cows to having dinner with a head of state. And so you need to be aware of the scope of things that you're going to be involved in, plan for those things, have advanced knowledge of your calendar and what the minister is doing. And most importantly is anticipate, right? Your job is to know what is going on, not only with your minister on a moment by moment basis, and anticipate every need that you possibly can. The best staffers are the ones that anticipate and have all of their bases covered. There are no surprises. Everything from, where's the closest washroom to will I have a cell signal? If I don't have a cell signal, what is my backup? Where do we park? How far a walk is it? What type of footwear should we be wearing? All of those things, need to be considered, and you need to know all of those things very quickly. The other thing is, not only do you need to know what is going on with your minister in your ministry, but really good staffers have an awareness of what is going on in government in general. I wake up in the morning every day at about 5 a.m. That's where I start my day. I have a cup of coffee. I watch the news. I am on the internet. I probably read about 5 newspapers by 6 a.m. And by that time, I'm usually on my 3rd Nespresso. And I like to get to the office very early, sometimes between 7:30 and 8:30. That's when I clear out my inbox and, don't have a lot of people around, so I can, get all of those things out of the way so I can focus on what's coming at me that day. So, anticipate.
That's great. That's great advice and really wise words there. And Nespresso is just one more way that you and George Clooney are very, very similar, obviously. So I know that, that list of things is quite long. I'm going to transition here just a little bit in terms of now. This is not an easy job all the time, obviously, and the files can be quite tense, and there can be some friction that comes there with, especially when you're dealing with other levels of government. I wanted to go back to Daryl's follow-up because it touched on something I wanted to talk here a little bit about. It says, basically, if I could follow up, he was talking before about how do you coordinate with staffers and government officials at different levels of government. So how do you work with them? And in particular, and I don't want to get us down a rabbit trail of talking about too many specific current issues. But it's well known that the government of Alberta and the government of Canada often have some different approaches and some different policy direction, shall we say, on some rather important files to the future of
Very
Alberta.
spicy.
So how do you keep that work moving forward with officials and
Sure.
At those multiple levels with those things going on?
Well, as a professional political operative, our job is to serve without passion or prejudice, right? And what I mean by that is that my colleagues in provinces across the country, we all know each other. It's a pretty rarefied air, right, to be the chief of staff of a premier. So there are not many of us. And we all know each other and we all talk to each other. And truth be told, we get pretty close and we talk about things. And, that can be, a chief in an NDP province or, this, that, or the other thing. Honestly, we're bonded by the role that we play and not necessarily the politics of the elected people. Now, to be sure, when it's game time, we're on and we'll duke it out. But we'll always dust ourselves off and shake hands and, be there for the next thing. And, some good examples of that are, we get into some very tough stuff with, British Columbia, for example. I mean, I personally have, really criticized some of the policies of British Columbia on the drugs files. British Columbia, obviously is very critical on environmental issues and, oil and gas. So we do that, but when there's fires burning up there, we are able to set those things aside and work together professionally. We see each other a couple of times a year at Council of the Federation and, federal, provincial, territorial meetings. We enjoy each other's companies. And so I think that the answer to the viewer's question is it's about relationship building, right? I mean, if you want to get work done, then you have to get in and build relationships. And those relationships need to be built on a foundation of professionalism and not immature, wanton political sniping. This is the NFL, and these are serious roles, and you got to be a pro. And most of the people that are in these jobs as chiefs to premiers, we share more in common than differ. The federal government is a little bit the same in that, despite all of the, spear chucking and, flame throwing that comes out of, us and Ottawa, and I have very, very close contacts in the PMO that I speak with on a very regular basis. And, we laugh and yell at each other and, do all of that. But at the end of the day, it comes down to, there is a line of professionalism. We understand that these are really serious issues, and that we have to keep the back channels open to stave off disaster, right? And we have to be available to each other for that. So that's how you do it.
That's great. Yeah, and it's consistent with I've experienced too a little bit where, obviously I've never been in the position as you of being a chief of staff to a premier, and having kind of a club of like 13 of you across the country. But I remember working with some officials, who used to be Liberal staffers, in the previous government before we became government. And at first you're kind of suspicious and, oh, yeah, can I work with them? But you're right, because you had that role. They knew what I was going through and they understood it. And it's sort of that role can be a more of a bond than necessarily the partisan stripe that you have. So,
yeah, the aspects of this job that can get a bit surreal sometimes. And, there are no other people who understand what it's like to be in this chair other than your colleagues. And then, of course, in Alberta, there are former chiefs, right? And, there's, I think, maybe 5 of them that are still alive, right? That have had this job before me. And we all talk on a regular basis as well, right? There, as a former chief, you sort of enjoy the privilege of, being able to pick up the phone and have a phone call, whenever you need to. I have enjoyed the counsel of my predecessors on a number of occasions, right? And I phone on a regular basis, sometimes just to check my thinking on something. And so that I think that's an important thing as well.
That's really great. It's great that you have that network. You mentioned about the fires and sort of how that, all of a sudden things get put partisanship gets put aside. Yeah. Obviously this was an issue we had to deal with during the election campaign, and it was very much where all of a sudden it was no longer that's a Steve problem. It was like, well, that's a Marshall problem. And we had the back and forth. And of course, on the political side, our calendar kept, just getting smashed to bits and, redesigned and so on. But can you
Yeah.
talk to folks just a little bit about what it's like to be in a truly emergency situation as a staffer, and in particular in your role? Because oftentimes, let's be honest, as when we're working on a lot of political things, we may feel like they're life and death, but they're not actually life and death. Uh, this was a situation where, like, it very much could have been that. So, can you talk to folks about when you got to switch gears? What's that like? What changes in sort of the mechanisms of government, and what role do you need to play in that type of situation?
Well, when big events like this happen, and I've been around for a couple of them. I mean, I was around in politics in BC during 9/11.
Hmm.
When we evacuated the cabinet out of the capital, crazy stuff. And there's been a number of big emergencies that I've been around for. COVID, right? Managing all through the pandemic, and fires, for sure is something that we unfortunately have become sort of used to, seasonal fire season. Um, you know, we're very good at turning on the lights and sirens and dealing. We have very well articulated processes for these. And when these things happen, when there is a big emergency like that, we have an emergency management cabinet committee. And so, really in my role, usually these things start off by the chief of staff in forestry, or wherever they have emergency service, or wherever, they'll wind up at my door kind of out of breath. And that's usually my oh shit moment.
Yeah.
Come in, what's going on? And I'll get sort of an early briefing that we have some information that something is about to happen, or something is going on. And so we'll monitor it for a little bit. And then, of course, I usually have to make the decision, when to brief the premier. And, I like to, when I go in and do that, I like, you got to know what you're talking about. You need to have your details and have people on standby for additional information. And so in the case of the fires, you're right. I mean, I was very much looking forward to, a lovely 30 days with all of you out of the building and doing the campaigning. Alas, that was not to be. And, I remember that day, very well, where I had to phone the premier and say, we're activating the emergency management committee. And all of these ministers are going to need to, snap to and be present to what's going on. And it was very serious. And I remember phoning you, basically saying, I'm coming in and taking control of the premier and the schedule, and this is good luck. But and of course it's a difficult call, right? Because you have a campaign to win, and at that point I don't care about the campaign, right? I've got lives to save. But I think we managed to thread a very difficult needle, and keep that political work happening, while at the same time balancing what we needed to do for Albertans and the province. So
That's great. We're coming into the final home stretch here, kind of about 10 minutes, and so I'm just going to jump into some viewer questions. So they may not be as thematic, but I want to make sure that folks get the chance to
I'll keep
ask
my
what
answer
they need to.
short.
Yeah. So Matthew had a question here, and it's a bit specific. He's kind of saying, do you see a function for policy advisors across ministry to form a committee to share ideas and so on? Maybe to kind of steer away from a specific structure, but what's your view on how important it is for policy advisors across the ministries to be working together, and have, what advice would you give on that?
Hey, Matt. Look, I'm always game for employees talking to each other and sharing ideas. Should they form a committee? I don't necessarily know that they should form a committee. I'm not terribly big on, lots of committees and meetings. I'm more interested in doing. So, it's something that I'm happy to talk about. But let me think about that.
Excellent. Okay. Going to go with Leah's question next. And this gets into the thing where you are not partisan in certain ways, but then, the politics have got to be there in the back
Oh,
of
I'm
mind.
partisan.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah. You are partisan. You're right.
Fire-breathing conservative. Yeah.
So looking at the current political landscape and the shift that occurred in the election, how much does winning back seats play into decisions and the structure of policy and planning? And you can proceed with caution on that one. But.
Look, I think that I think you can read this question in a sort of cynical political way, or you can choose to read it as, when you say winning back seats. In my mind, winning back seats is corollary with doing things that the electorate in a jurisdiction feels is lacking and wants more of. And so I don't know that I would couch the question as winning back seats, more than I would say we obviously view the loss of seats as an indication that there is something in policy that we have lacked in a particular jurisdiction, and that we need to pay attention to that. And so I'm not sure that I would necessarily take the view that we do policies with the specific goal of winning back seats, that we kind of leave for campaigns. But we absolutely do a postmortem and try and understand what has shifted in the electorate in a certain jurisdiction, and see what we can do for that electorate there. So
I love your approach to that. I mean, I just want to agree with it, publicly, because I recall, in 2015 and the federal scene when we lost. Leading into that, I was working in a minister's office as a chief, and there were caucus members who were coming and making these big statements like, if I don't get this funding for this project, I will lose, or if I get this, I will win. And in the end,
they all say that.
Yeah, and it became a change election, and everyone lost, even though they delivered everything. So it's sort of like, I think the idea that, I can go and deliver, this big check somewhere and I will win. There's broader things, and I think you're quite attuned to that and quite wise to focus on the broader success of the government than, whether or not the Boys and Girls Club got the literacy grant. I mean, it's not that that's a bad thing, but it doesn't necessarily do that. So, okay. I'm going to go to what might be our last question here from Oguzi, who says, as the chief of staff, this could be a bit of a sensitive one too, but how do you handle situations where your personal opinions or convictions on an issue or policy differ from those in the premier or the cabinet? I mean, this is it's a team approach, so not everyone's going to get their way all the time. How do you navigate that?
Well, look, I think that is a great question. I think the reality is that as a political staffer, you are not the show here, right? You're here to serve the will of cabinet, and so when cabinet makes a decision in terms of the direction of a policy, then you really have two choices. You can do your job and execute on that policy, or you can find another job. And that decision is yours to make. But there really aren't any two things. That we swear an oath of allegiance to cabinet, as a confidential and trusted advisor. And that's how it goes. And I luckily have not yet faced such an issue. I would have no problem making that decision. If there was something that came up that I felt the government was doing that I simply could not live with, then I would tender my resignation. Luckily, I've worked for some great leaders who have never taken the government in a direction where I have, felt that strongly. But, the day is young. We'll see.
And I think there would be a difference in that too, something that goes against like your core of who you are, what you believe, versus why did we do that instead of this, like that.
Yeah.
I think that's the wrong thing to do. Like,
yeah, look,
we're all gonna have differences of
we've all
opinion.
got choices to make, right?
Yeah.
And we're here by choice, and we're here because we choose to live a life of service, and that's the way it goes. And I would say to anybody, I mean, if there's something going on that you can't live with, put your name on the ballot the next time, run
Amen to
yourself,
that.
and make the change.
Yeah. And we'll be offering some webinars on that too. So you can go ahead and jump
Sure.
into that. Marshall, my last question to you is just sort of the any either sort of piece of advice that hasn't been given yet that you want to make sure that someone new getting into the staffer world takes into account. And I guess actually I'm going to do a double barrel one. Any advice on sort of keeping a work-life balance? Because these are demanding. Yeah. Everyone laughs at that question. I don't understand.
Look, I think it's important. It really is important.
In theory, you do, right?
I really try my best, and I think I'm actually pretty successful at it. I take time off. I try and spend. I try and be very strategic throughout the year. I try and plan my year, right? At the beginning of the year, with the times that I'm going to go on vacation, and I get those booked into the calendar before life takes over. So I like to take sort of 2 more significant trips a year, usually one in the winter and sort of one in the summertime. And then I'd like to go away for kind of 3 long weekends that are, I don't go far, but I like to, go away either to BC or Palm Springs or, something, New York maybe. And so I kind of plan that self-care to break it up, and then everything, kind of fills in around it. And I get very protective of that time. Right. And, I also have to consider my own life. I have a chronic illness of addiction, and that means that I have to live my life in a certain way in order to stay healthy. And so, self-care is a really big part of my recovery and my life, just like it is for a diabetic to, watch their sugars and things like that. But I don't think that you need to have a story like mine in order to know that you got to look after yourself. So I would do that. And, work-life balance, that is hard to do. And that's why these jobs are very difficult, right? There's no 9 to 5. Unfortunately, that's simply the job you've chosen. But I find that more often than not, it balances out, right? I mean, usually the things that happen in government are fits and spurts. And, you'll go a period of time where things are really intense, and then they'll cool down for a bit. And unfortunately for me, it's kind of always intense. For minister's office, they have their intense moment. And for me, I'll deal with their intense moment and then move on to another minister's intense moment. And, with the premier, there's always intense moments. So, yeah.
That's great. Well, look, Marshall, this has been fantastic. We appreciate, obviously, we could listen to you for hours on all this. And I really appreciate you coming and investing your time here tonight. We know that you're a busy person with all those intense moments. and to everyone kind of watching now or on demand later on as they're watching this, you know, the whole idea behind Right Recruiter is to say, you know, like there is a conservative network out there. There are staffers who want to see you succeed if you're getting into this field, and they're very gracious people like Marshall who will come and share their wisdom. Actually, Marshall, I forgot to ask you one thing, is that if anyone is looking to jump into the staffer world in the government of Alberta, how do they do that?
So I'm responsible for all hiring.
We may have frozen. I don't know if that's on my end or not.
I can hear you just fine. Can you hear me? Yeah. Can you hear me? You're nodding, so I think you're saying
yeah.
yes.
No, we're good now. Yeah, it froze for a moment.
So I'm responsible
yeah.
for our human resources and all hiring in my office. Some is managed by my deputy, and so I'm always happy to receive resumes, you know, and entertain. You know, we're always looking for bright young talent, sharply dressed, and you know, please, you know, forward in your stuff. And I thank you, Steve,
well,
for
thanks
this
again
as well. Right? I mean, it's a fantastic idea, and I just you know, I'm a really big supporter of what you're trying to do here. So.
Great. Well, thanks. And thanks for that. And thanks for being a part of it and investing your time to make it work. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us in our webinar tonight. And yeah, I will be having the announcement of our next one coming up here shortly. Going to be another great person with a lot of great perspective. And I hope you'll be joining us for that. So take care and enjoy the rest of your week. Bye-bye.